Hi again, Mark here from TalkingBass.net. Last week I released a lesson on getting through a basic 12-bar blues progression in a shuffle style. This week I'm going to look at the same progression in a more blues rock kind of style, and we'll look at connecting the chords just as we did before, and we'll also look at how to put some fills in there. You can play along to the backing track over at TalkingBass.net on the practice tracks page. Just follow the link below. You'll need to be signed in to access it, but don't worry, it's a free sign up, and once you're signed in, you'll have access to a load of bass practice resources, ebooks and a forum, so go check it out. Okay, we'll be using the same progression as we did last week, so I'll just go over the chords as a refresher. But if you're unsure about what any of these chords are or why we're using them, just check out that first lesson on YouTube or TalkingBass.net, and again, I'll provide a link in the info below. So we'll stick to the key of C for now, and if we just work through that 12-bar progression, so obviously we've got 12 bars, we have C7 for 1 bar, F7 for 1 bar, then we have C7 for 2 bars. Then we have F7 for 2 bars and C7 for 2 bars. Then we have G7 for a bar, F7 for a bar, C7 back for a bar, and then G7 for a bar. So, you know, on the face of it, that sounds like a long string of chords if you don't know the progression already, but it is just a core basic blues progression with a couple of added chord 4s in there, which are the F7s, and we've got a turnaround at the end. So by number, because we're in the key of C there, so by number we have chord 1, and then 4, and then back to 1, so that's C7, F7, C7. Then we have the F7 again, which is chord 4, back to chord 1, and then we have the G7, which is chord 5, then down to chord 4, again, the F7, chord 1 again, and then a chord 5 at the end, the G7, to use as a turnaround. So it's handy to know the chords as numbers so that you can modulate to any key, okay? So you want to go through that chord progression, and we'll be going through with the track in a second, but you want to learn that chord progression by note in the key of C and by number, okay? So let's try playing along with that backing track. We're just going to stick with root notes for now, so C for a C7, F for an F7, and we're going to use a rhythmic pattern that goes like this. Okay, so very simple rhythmic pattern, which you'll hear when I play along with it in a second. And yeah, we're not going to add any notes in there, approach notes or any of that stuff, just that, okay? So, with the backing track. Okay, so that was once through the whole progression, so you want to play around and round with the backing track, just playing along, just with those root notes, with that simple rhythm, until you've got the chords, you know, under the fingers, got it memorized, and like I say, by note and by number. Next, we could try adding a little rhythmic interest in there by just following along a little with the guitars and the piano. So, to do that, I'm going to use this rhythm. Okay, so the first rhythm was, and now we have, and we'll just keep that going through the progression, okay? So, I'll play along with it so you can hear me playing that rhythm and just try and follow along with it. And, you know, it is transcribed there in the lesson material, so just follow the link below. So if you're at YouTube, follow the link to TalkingBass.net, and then if you're at TalkingBass.net, just hit that download link button, okay? So, here it is with the track. So, like I've said, you can just play round and round and round on that backing track, just playing around with it and just getting used to locking in with the drums, locking in there with the rest of the instruments, and just get used to that chord progression, okay? Like I say, the backing track is there at TalkingBass.net on the practice tracks page. It's all there for free. You just go on there and you can just play it and it'll go round and round and round and round. I think it goes on for about 6 minutes. So you get to just play along with it, you know, and just get used to it. Okay, so now let's add a bit of melodic interest by approaching each chord just as we did in the last lesson. So if you remember, we can approach each chord chromatically from above or below. And all we have to do is approach from 2 frets above or below the next root note. So if I'm on a C, so there it is for the C7, and the next chord is going to be the F, I can approach that from 2 frets above. So there's the C, so if I'm going to approach the F there at the 3rd fret of the D string, I could approach from the G, so 2 frets above, and we just play G, G flat, F. So I'm just playing each one of those frets. So the 2nd fret above, the next fret above, and then the F. So I've got C, so G, G flat, F. 5th fret, 4th fret, 3rd fret. That's all it is. So you don't have to think about the theory behind this or anything like that. It's just 2 frets above and you just approach it. Okay? And we can do the same from below. So if I'm on the C there again, we're approaching the F. I have to think to myself, okay, here comes an F. You look down 2 frets below, E flat, 1st fret there at the D string, and then E, natural, the 2nd fret of the D string, and then the F. So that's all it is. So we're looking, you have to look at the chord that you're approaching. So don't just think of the chord that you're on, you think of the chord that you're moving to. So you think, okay, here comes the F. I can either approach from the G above or from the E flat below. Okay? Like I say, you don't even have to think of the notes. You just think 2 frets above or 2 frets below. That's it. Okay, so that's how to approach these chords. So we could use this approach note system to approach any of the chords in this progression. So we just approach the F, but we could approach the G. So if the G was just coming up, we could use the A flat, G. So 5th, 4th, 3rd fret, if we're on the E string there. Or we could come up from the F, F sharp, G. Okay? And if we're coming back to the C, we could use the D flat, C, or B flat, B, C. Again, just look up or down 2 frets and just move into it from there. We could also use different rhythms. So I've just been using 8th notes there, so they're a little quicker. Okay, so that's a little quicker. I could use quarter notes, which would sound like this. Which drags it out a little bit. So just a little bit of diversity there just by doing that. So like I say, we can approach any of the chords in this progression from there. So the C, the F or the G, and we can use either of those rhythms. So as I said earlier, this approach note system was covered in the last lesson. So if you're having any problems, you know, getting your head around it, just go over that lesson because I do go into it a little bit more in a little bit more detail. So I'll just run through the track, and the first time through I will play with approach notes from above. Second time, approach notes from below, and then the third time I'll mix it all up, okay? And I'll use a variety of different rhythms. So, here with the track. obviously you don't want to feel pressured into using approaches on every single chord change like I did there. It'll get predictable and boring. So try mixing them all up with no approaches at all. And remember, this is all just for practice. You know, when you're practicing, you can take things to extremes just to get used to certain moves. But on a gig or a rehearsal situation with other live musicians, you want to be listening to everything around you, listening to the other musicians and looking just to complement the music. Now, there's also one last rhythmic pattern that I want to look at here, and it's the straightforward eighth note rock pedal. Now, it's a little bit busier than the previous comping patterns, and it has a lot more momentum and propulsion if that's what you're after. And it sounds like this. Okay, so we're just playing straight eighth notes. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and okay. So that can come in handy over this kind of style because there is quite a lot of momentum in there. Now it's not always going to work. You have to play what works, you know, with the feel that you're after. But we'll try going through it anyway. So I'm going to work through the track again, exactly the same, just playing with the root notes and see how that style sounds. Okay. So with the track. So that's a set of basic bass lines for working through that progression and some little approaches in there. But you're also going to have to work through that chord progression with riffs. You know, that's very, very common. So here I'm just going to give you a very basic kind of blues rock riff and we'll work it through the chord progression, okay? So the riff's going to sound like this. Okay? So I'll just run through it and then we'll take it through the progression. So we've got C twice, then we move up E flat to E natural there, so that's the 6th fret to the 7th fret on the A string. So then we play the G, the 5th fret of the D string twice. The first one I generally cut short, so. And then we just play the E flat to the E natural again on the A string, which is the 6th fret to the 7th fret. So. Okay, so that's the riff. So then we just need to move it through the progression. So we need to transpose that to F and G. Okay, so if we were to play it on an F, we just take that exact same pattern. Okay, so we're playing the F there, then the A flat and the A natural there, 4th fret, 5th fret on the E string, up to the C, 3rd fret of the A string and back. Okay, so. But if you know it as a fretboard pattern, you can just move it around. Then the same thing on the G. G. So we've got G, G, B flat, B, natural, D, B flat, B, and back, okay? But the best way to do this is to just see it as a fretboard shape, really, and just move it around. It saves a lot of time trying to think of the notes there. So that's the riff. So let's try it with the track, okay? Okay? So, as a little analysis of that riff's working around a basic major arpeggio, but we're using the minor third to the major third in there, okay? So on the C, we've got the C, which is the root note, then we've got the E flat to the E natural, which is the minor third, the sad sound there, to the major third, which is the happy sound. And that move, the minor third to the major third, is a really, really, really popular bluesy kind of move. You get it all the time. Okay? You'll get it in all kinds of licks. That sound there. Okay, so it's what gives it that kind of bluesy sound. And we've got it there in the riff. If it was just the major arpeggio, wouldn't sound as bluesy. Minor, again, that just sounds a little bit sad. Put the two together, so it's that. That's the minor third to major third, and you can just move that around all over the place, just trying it out, and it works particularly well over dominant 7 chords, just like we're getting this blues. So now we've worked through the progression, let's try adding some fills in there. Now the most obvious place to put a fill is on the final bar leading back into the top of the sequence, but you can put them anywhere. It's just that, they're more suited to signalling the end of a section. So we'll try putting a fill on the G7 at the 12th bar, and we're going to, all we're going to do first of all is just play a root note, okay? So we're just going to play the G, and all I'm going to do is take it up the octave, well, we'll take it up to there, up to the 10th fret of the A string, and just play 8th notes on it, okay? So it's an incredibly simple fill. There's no, arpeggios or scales in there, we're just going to play the root notes. So I'll play through the chord progression again, just using a basic comp, and then I'll put that in as the fill, and you'll see how it works, okay? Here we go. Okay. Now, obviously, that's a pretty basic fill. We're only using one note, so the fill is, it's more of a highlighting of the rhythm than anything else. But playing it up in this upper register draws a little attention to it. And it's a little bit like becoming a drummer. That's how you want to think of this. We're basically playing a drum fill on the bass. And in this case, we're just playing it with one note, Just think of hitting a snare and some toms, dagga, 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 to bring it back in. So, okay, so that's all we're doing. We're basically playing a drum fill on one note. So now let's add some extra notes in there. And as with the standard bass lines, in all the different styles that I cover, the first port of call should be the chord tones. So we're on a G7 here for the fill, so we need to know the G7 arpeggio, okay? Because the arpeggio, that is the notes of the chord tones, okay? So let's have a look at the notes of a G7. So we have the G, and it's basically a major arpeggio with a flattened 7th on the top, a minor 7th up there. So we have G, B, D, F, and then we can play the G again and start again. So G, B, D, F, G, B, D, F, etc. So think of a major arpeggio. So if we're down here in this area, 3rd fret of the E string there for the G, B, 2nd fret of the A string, D, 5th fret of the A string, and then F, 3rd fret of the D string. And you can put the other G up on there, on the top, the 5th fret of the D string. Just play that up and down, okay? And get used to the look of that shape, okay? And then you can move it anywhere. So let's say we take it up to the 10th fret there of the A string, the G there. We can play it there, we can play it here. Okay? And really, eventually you want to be able to extend it, and move it around all over the place. But for now, if this is the first time that you've ever tried this kind of thing, just learn the notes and the construction of that arpeggio. You really need to know it's a major arpeggio with a flat 7 on the top, and just get used to the shape. So to create a really basic fill, just using that arpeggio, we could just play up and down the arpeggio, okay? So we'll play it down here. So just G, B, D, F, then we get to the top, the octave, G, F, D, B, and then we're back to the C, okay? So we're just playing it in straight eighth notes, just like we did, just as we did with that single note, but we're playing, and that leads us back into the C. So I'll just play the last 4 bars and then we'll play it with the track. So last 4 bars from the G7 would be 2, 3, 4, G, F, C. Okay, and then we're back. Now, obviously, it sounds a little bit, mechanical and a bit too arpeggio-like, but you have to remember that this is just a palette of notes. That's all it is. We can play up and down like that, but we don't have to. We can play any of those notes in any order, okay? That's just the set of notes that we can use. We could play, just an F. And then, I played a G at the end there, but, in any order. So, I'll just play with the track just to hear how that sounds. So once you've familiarised yourself with the sound and shape of that arpeggio, you can start to mess around with it. Now, there's an infinite number of possibilities with this, so you just have to practice and experiment with it. But just as an example of how you can play around with those notes, I'll show you 2 very different lines. Now, the first is an example of how you can play a longer arpeggio by extending the notes beyond a 1-octave pattern. And then the second line is much more confined and shows you how you can just make a fill using only a few notes from, that overall arpeggio palette. So the first run is going to start at the 12th fret of the G string, and we're going to just come down the G7 arpeggio. So we're going to work down from G, 12th fret, then F, the 10th fret, then we move on to the D string and play the 12th fret, the D, and then the B, the 9th fret. So far we have... And it's worth just telling you that we're not going to start on the beat. We'll start on the and of 1. Okay, so it's 1 and da da dun. Okay, so 1 ba da da dun, 1 ba da da dun. Okay, so we've got G, F, D, B. Then we have the G, 10th fret of the A string. So we've come down the arpeggio. So if you just familiarise yourself with the arpeggio up there, exactly the same as. But we've come down, so 1. Then we extend it. So if you were to look at the top of this arpeggio and take that pattern down the octave, you can see that we've got the F there at the 8th fret of the A string, so that's the flat 7th, and then down to the D, the 10th fret of the E string. So, and then we're back to the C. So we've just descended through the arpeggio and extended it a little using the 7th and the 5th. Okay, so instead of just being a small box pattern up and down, we're actually starting a lot higher and just descending. Okay, so it still sounds a little, stereotypically arpeggio-like, but because we've extended it a little bit and we've moved up into a higher register, it's not as, predictable. So, I'll just try that with the backing track. Here it comes. So you want to practice playing that line along with the backing track, moving the position, getting used to that. And once you've mastered playing that G7 arpeggio down like that, it makes you realise how important it is to learn your arpeggios all over the neck so that you can just move around and just play them wherever. Try playing sequences through them, so you play 3s and 4s. All over the place, you know, in every position, okay? And there are loads and loads of lessons based on that over at TalkingBass.net showing you how to play the arpeggios all over the neck, okay? So that was one way of doing it. Now, the other way that we could play it is by using less notes. So if we look down here again at the G7 arpeggio, okay, so we're back down there. This time we're just going to use a few of them. So we'll start with the D. So the fill is going to sound like this. Okay, so a very, very simple fill. So that's all we've got. So we've got the D, 5th fret of the A string, F, 3rd fret of the D string, back to the D there, 5th fret of the A string. So, and then we go up to the G, 5th fret of the D string. And then we come down it, so we've got the F, 3rd fret of the D string, and back down to the 5th fret of the A string. So, oh, sorry, there's 2 notes. We play 2 notes on the G there. So, and as we did on the last run, we're coming in after the first beat, so it's on the and of 1. So 1, okay, 1 and, etc. Okay, so I'll just play the last 4 bars. So 2, 3, 4. G, F, C. Okay, and you can see we are still using the notes of that G7 arpeggio, but we're not playing straight up and down, you know, and that's what gives it that stereotypical arpeggio sound, you know, that you might not want. You want it to sound a little bit more melodic. So, but like I said, D, F and G, it's the 5th, the flat and 7th, and the root note there. You know, we are still using the notes of the G7 arpeggio. So when people talk about chord tones and playing arpeggios, you know, because every teacher under the sun on YouTube especially, you'll see everybody talking about chord tones, you know, and when you start looking at chord tones and you see these arpeggio patterns, you start thinking, oh, arpeggios, you know, it's just this ba 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 ba, you know, kind of thing, and it starts to sound classical. You know, it's like, I want to rock out, you know, and you can see here that you don't have to play arpeggios up and down. It's just a palette. That's all it is. It's just a set of notes, and you can use whichever ones you want out of there in whatever order you want. You know, I suppose you know you've got to hear it in your head. You've got to know what you're going to play. Don't just randomly do it. But that fill there is simply using a small segment of the arpeggio. So now, just to hear it with the rest of the instruments, let's hear it with the track. So you can see there, just by using just a few notes there instead of the whole arpeggio, it's a little bit more subtle, okay, and a bit more straight to the point. Now, as well as the arpeggio, we can also use some scale lines in there by filling in the gaps between the arpeggio. And to save time, I'll just let you know that we can use a Mixolydian scale over the G7. So a G Mixolydian scale looks like this. Well, before I say it, just to make it a bit easier, it's a major scale with a flattened 7th, okay? So as we're going through this, keep that in mind. So if we start on a G there, we've got G, A, B, C, D, E, F natural there, G. Okay, so like I said, it's a major scale with a flattened 7th. So G, 3rd fret of the E string, A, 5th fret of the E string, B, 2nd fret of the A string, C, 3rd fret of the A string, D, 5th fret of the A string, E, 2nd fret of the D string, F natural, the 3rd fret of the D string, and then finally the G. So you want to try that scale up and down. And once you've got that off, we can start adding some fills in there. So just as we did with the arpeggio, let's first of all just try playing the scale up and down, just as a fill, okay? And as happened last time, yes, it'll sound a little mechanical and a little scale-like, but don't worry about that. Again, it's just a palette, and we'll expand on that as we go. So all we're going to play for the fill is just straight up from the G up to the G, okay? And we'll start it on the 1 this time. So I'll just play along with the track and you can hear how that sounds. Comes. Okay. Now, just as a quick tip, when you're looking at scales like this, like Mixolydian scales and Dorian scales and all that kind of stuff, and even blues scales and pentatonics, you can also look at that scale as an arpeggio with some extra passing notes in there, and that can be really, really useful when you're playing this kind of thing, as you'll see. So I'll get onto that in a second. But so the G Mixolydian scale that we just played. Now have a look at the G7 arpeggio, because the G7 arpeggio is in there. So, okay, so we've got the G, B, D, F. So if we look back at the scale, you can see that we've got the G, that's the root note there, that's the first note of the arpeggio, and then we've got the B there, and we're just joining up the G and the B with the A. Okay, that's all it is. We put the second in there between the first and the third. So the arpeggio would be G to B. We've just filled the gap. We've just bridged it with the A. So G, A, B. Think about what the next note of the arpeggio would be after the B. It's going to be the D. Okay, so we've got a note in between the B and the D, the C. Okay, so we've got the fourth in there between the third and the fifth. So keep going. G, A, B, then B, C, D. That's all we've done. We've bridged that gap. And then think about the next note of the arpeggio. It's going to be the F, okay? So in between the D and the F, we've got the E there. So again, we've bridged the gap between the D and the F, and then we're back to the G, okay? So the Mixolydian scale there is simply a G7 arpeggio with some notes in between, okay? So we've got a second between the first and the third, we've got a fourth between the third and the fifth, and we've got the sixth between the fifth and the seventh. And it can be really useful to see it like this, because if you can get used to playing around with the chord tones, which are the most important notes in there, you know, on a hierarchical level, you know, you want the chord tones first and foremost, because that's what's been specified in the harmony. You know, the chord is a G7, you know, that's what we've got to play with. So they're the first notes you want to go for. They're the consonant notes, the one that we'll always resolve to. And then the other notes, the second, the fourth, and the sixth, the A, the C, and the E in there, the extra notes there in that Mixolydian scale, you can just think of those as notes joining up those arpeggio notes. So you're always going to then use the notes of the chord, the arpeggio notes, as our main notes, and use those extra scale notes in there for a little bit of added flavour and, you know, for melodic devices, for, you know, for moving around. So it's just a way of getting into your head that the chord tones are the first, you know, most important thing, and the scale tones, they come after, you know, because we're joining them up. So from that perspective of trying to see it as the arpeggio with a few little notes around it, let's have a look at a run that uses that G Mixolydian but tries to avoid being too scale-like. Because when I say scale-like, I mean, you know, just going up and down a scale, you know, because it starts to sound too much like a scale, you know. We want it to have a little bit more originality to it, a bit more melodicism. So, and if you stick just to arpeggios, it's going to sound too arpeggio-like. If you stick just to scale movement, it's going to sound too scale-like. You want bits of repetition in there, things like that, just to, you know, give it a little bit more personality. So this run is rhythmically not going to be that interesting. We're going to use the same kind of rhythm as before, but we're going to come down the Mixolydian scale. So we've got G, F, E, D. Okay, so we're coming down it. We're starting on the and of one again, so 1. And then we're going to come down to the root note, the G, and then play the A, and then back to the G. Okay, so. And then we're back to the C. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. That's the fill. Okay, so G, F, E, D. So the D string, 5th fret, 4th fret, sorry, 5th fret, 3rd fret, 2nd fret, then to the 5th fret of the A string for the D. So we're just descending through the Mixolydian, then down to the G, 3rd fret of the E string, to the A, 5th fret of the E string, and back to the G, 3rd fret of the E string. Okay, so if I now play the last 4 bars, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so I'll play that with the backing track so we can hear how it sounds with the instruments. So you want to experiment with the chord tones and the scales, just, you know, making up fills, just experiment with them, trying to get used to the sound of them and get used to some different patterns in there. And then once you feel confident with the arpeggios and the scales, you can start to incorporate chromatic notes. Now, don't worry about that sounding complicated, because it's not. All we're going to do is fill in the gaps between the scale notes. So when we played the arpeggio, we had the gaps of thirds in between them. When we played the scale, we were, you know, bridging the gaps between the arpeggios, just filling in the gaps there. Now all we're doing is filling the gaps again between the scale notes, okay? And all we're going to do is use those to approach the chord tones. So this will all make sense when we work through it, okay? So if we have a look at the G7 arpeggio again, then have a look at the G Mixolydian scale. So we filled in the gaps between those arpeggios, so we've just made it a little bit more dense. Now all we do is fill in the gaps between those scale notes. So we'll start from the bottom. So we've got the G to A, that's the Mixolydian scale. We're going to put a G sharp in there. Okay, so we've got G, G sharp, A. That's all we've done. We've filled in that gap, okay? And we're going to look at them individually. You know, we're not just going to play, you know, just a chromatic scale. We want to see them in relation to the actual chord tones, the arpeggio there, and the scale. So we've got G, G sharp, A. Now that move there, you would generally use in descent, so that we're approaching the chord tone, because the A is not the chord tone, the G is. You know, we want to approach the root note. And for that, you get this kind of sound, which, if you think back to the chromatic approach notes, that's all we were doing. You know, if we were approaching the G, we were approaching from 2 notes up, A flat, G. That's all we're doing, okay? So we could use that. Then if we were going to move up even further, once we get past the A, we've got the A sharp or B flat up to the B. Now, this is the one that we saw earlier on in the riff. The minor third to major third. That's all it is. It's a little chromatic approach note in there. So we've just filled in the gap between the A and the B. That's all we've done. And like I said, that's so popular. And you get little fills like this. So if I was, you know, you get that nice little sound in there. So we'll come back to that in a minute. Then if we keep working up through the scale, G, A, B, C, the next note would be D. So in between there we have the C sharp. And again, that's a really popular note. So, you know, you might get used to hearing that kind of sound in walking bass lines. So it's that sharpened 4 moving up to the 5th. And again, don't just see it as a chromatic scale. You want to see it as a chromatic movement from the C up to the D, okay? We're approaching the chord tone. We're approaching the 5th, the D. So, you know, with that in mind, when we used the flattened second there, we were approaching the root note. When we used the minor third in there, we were approaching the major third, which is the chord tone. Now we're approaching the 5th. Now if we go further beyond there, we've got the D to E in the scale. In between there, we've got the D sharp to the E, okay? okay? And again, we want to approach the chord tone. You don't have to, but it would sound better in this context. So we want to descend, because otherwise we'd be moving to the 6th, okay? So E, E flat, D, okay? Okay, so it has that sense of resolution. Whenever you're working chromatically like this, you've got these little half-step moves. They really want to resolve, you know, because the chromatics themselves have got a lot of tension. You want to maximize that resolution, and that's why landing on a chord tone works so well, okay? So, once we get up to the 6th there, we keep going, there's the flat and 7th, and then the next note would be the root note, so we've just got another note in between there, the F sharp, okay? So this is the major 7th in there. Okay, and again, you could use this either way. You could use it ascending or descending. So if we're on a G, you know, you could use it descending from the root note down to the flat and 7th, or we could use it ascending from the flat and 7th up to the root note. Okay, so that's how to use chromatic notes. You want to use them as passing notes, really, or approach notes, approaching the chord tones. I mean, there's a million and one different ways that you can use chromatic notes. You know, there's music like serial music that's completely based on chromatic scale, well, 12-tone rows. But in this, where, you know, for a fill, you want to try, just start by playing, approaching the chord tones. Okay, so that's how to start using chromatics. So now I'll just give you a couple of fills using chromatic notes just to give you an idea of how they can sound. So this first fill is going to sound like this. Okay, so we're on the G. Okay, and we're coming back to the C. So we begin on the B flat, 1st fret of the A string, and we slide up to the B, 2nd fret of the A string. So we've got the minor 3rd to major 3rd move. So that's that cool little move there. And then we play the 5th of the chord, the D, so that's the 5th fret of the A string. So then we play the F and the F sharp and the G. Okay, so that's 3rd fret, 4th fret, 5th fret of the D string. And then finally, just to lead back into the C as a chromatic approach note, we'll play the D flat back to the C. So 4th fret of the A string back to the 3rd fret. Okay, so like I say, all of this stuff is in the downloadable lesson material in sheet music and tab. Okay, so the overall fill, it starts on the and of 1, so we would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Okay, so that's the fill. Okay, so lots of chromatic movement going on in there. So I'll just play the last 4 bars. So 2, 3, 4, G, F, C, and we're back into the C. Okay, so you want to practice that round and round until you've got it under your fingers. Now let's try it with the track, just to hear how it sounds with the instruments. When you're playing through that fill, always remember to look at the notes of the arpeggio and see them in relation to that. Don't just learn it as a linear line that, oh yeah, I've got this lick, man. You know, try and analyze it. See it as the notes of the arpeggio and see how it's approaching each one. We've got that minor 3rd to the major 3rd there. We come up through the arpeggio, we get up to the 7th. So we're basically coming up through the arpeggio from the 3rd, but we've just approached it from below. And then we're just filling in the gap to get up to the octave. So see the arpeggio and just see these other notes around it, okay? For the next fill, I'm going to use some of the other chromatics in there. So I'm going to use the flat and 2nd and the sharp and 4th. So I'll just play the last 4 bars just to let you hear how this sounds first of all. So 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that's the fill. So We're going to start at the A up here at the 7th fret of the D string, and then just work down 6th fret, 5th fret. So we've got A flat, G, and then we move down to the B and just come up through the scale there, B, C, and then C sharp, D. Okay, so 2nd fret, 3rd fret, 4th fret, 5th fret. So that's the good thing about these chromatic fills. You're just moving up fret by fret by fret. You know, it can be quite easy in that sense. So the timing is going to be on the and of 1 again. So it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And it brings us back to the C, okay? So I'll just try that with the track. Now, finally, let's have a look at another incredibly important aspect of the fill, and that's rhythm. Now, probably the biggest, most noticeable difference that you can make in creating fills is by making use of offbeat or upbeat eighth notes. So instead of playing either eighth notes like this, or quarter notes like this, you can play offbeats like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, okay? Upbeats create tension, and if you compare rhythm to melody, the upbeats are like the non-chord tones or the chromatic notes in that they want to resolve, and they can make a relatively bland line come to life by adding that element of tension. So if I was to take a straightforward G7 arpeggio like this, and play it in quarter notes as a fill, it could sound quite boring. But if we then put those notes onto the upbeats, so on the and, so 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, you can hear how it will sound different. So we would then have 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, as opposed to 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'll just play through the final 4 bars and use that as the fill. And first time I'll play on the downbeats, so 1, 2, 3, 4. And the second time I'll play 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and on the upbeats, and you'll see how it sounds. So 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that was on the downbeats, so quite boring. Now I'll play on the upbeats. Sorry. 2, 3, 4. Okay, so you can hear how it gives it that tension and makes a relatively bland line sound quite interesting. So this principle is the same in every other aspect of music, whether we're playing melodies, bass lines, chords, or anything. The use of upbeats generates tension. So now I'll run through that progression with the track, and I'll just try to use as many offbeat eighth note approaches as I can, okay? So I'm going to be putting them in all over the place, not just on the fill. And you'll hear how it can generate that tension, okay? So, here we go. So hopefully that's going to inspire you to come up with some more interesting bass lines and fills, whatever the style. Next lesson, I'll be looking at the basics of a jazz blues, and we'll look at how we can apply walking bass lines into the 12-bar progression. So check out TalkingBass.net for over 100 more bass lessons, and sign in to play along with some of the backing tracks that I've been using in this video. Okay? See you later!